Hey there, welcome back to the channel. My name is Andrew Clark, and in this video I want to talk about the pros and cons of a real tube amplifier and an amp sim pedal. And there's a very specific reason I want to talk about this today. And that's because over the weekend, I went and played a gig. And this was a gig where I didn't take my big amp with me. Instead, I just took the UA Dream 65. Now at this point, I've already played a few gigs with it, and obviously the convenience and the sound and stuff like that have made it a pretty good experience. But at this specific show that I was playing, something went horribly wrong. Our entire ear rig system went down during the set. Now typically this is super annoying, but it's not a huge deal. You just pop your ears out and you can hear everything on the stage. The problem was we had no wedge monitors and there was no amp behind me. So instead of stopping the set, because we're professionals, we carried on through it and I couldn't hear my guitar at all. In that moment, the only thing I really wished that I had was my amp. So this terrible experience just kind of inspired me to make a video about the differences between using a real amp or just going direct. So I've got my guitar here and my whole rig set up, and I just thought it would be a good idea to maybe, before we get into the technicalities of everything, just go back and forth and show you a few tones between the amp and the Dream 65. If you're looking for a more in-depth video on the Universal Audio Dream 65, I do have that on my channel and I'll be sure to link it in the description below. So as far as the signal chain goes, we're just going right into the pedal board, and then out from there we're using an A-B switcher so that I can quickly switch back and forth between the Dream 65 and my amp. The Dream 65 is just going directly into my audio interface, and my Dr. Z EZ-G50 is just going into an ISO cab that I built in the other room, which has a 12-inch speaker in it and an SM57. When the selector is on red, it's going into the Dream, and when it switches over to green, it'll be going into my amp. So we'll start off with some clean tones. It's just important to remember that the Dream 65 is modeled after a deluxe reverb, and the EZ-G50 is like a beefed up super reverb, so they're really not gonna sound that alike, but it's still fun to do a comparison. So here's the guitar with just a compressor and a little bit of reverb, and this is the amplifier first. So both are set up pretty clean. As for the settings on the Dream, I keep things super simple. I have the boost set very low. It's not toggled up or down, it's just set on stock. I like to use the EV12 speaker. If I find it's a little bit too bright, I will go to the GB25. They're similar sounding, but it's a little bit darker. And then I set the volume just under 9 o'clock, and then output to taste. We've got the reverb completely turned off, bass pulled down a little bit, treble pushed up a little bit. And that just kind of gives me a good pedal platform kind of sound. So I'll show you what they sound like with fuzz and overdrive and things like that. We'll start with the amp here, and we'll kick on the Benson Germanium fuzz. So when it comes to using fuzz with the Dream 65, I actually prefer to turn off the Cali 76, where I prefer to have it on if I'm using fuzz with the amp. And that's just because it cleans it up a little bit, so you can hear there's more definition when I turn that off. Next, we'll jump over to the King of Tone. I'll turn the Cali 76 back on. So you can hear the same overdrive actually reacts differently depending on whether I'm using the pedal or the amp. And that actually goes beyond just EQ. There's actually a bit of a feel difference. And that goes back to something else that I've talked about before. And that's just making sure that you're choosing the right overdrive for your amp sim pedal. So now I'm gonna hop over to the Archer, and you can hear it's got more mid-range than the King of Tone, and I actually prefer the way it sounds with the Dream. So I don't want to spend too much time on the tone comparison just because, like I said, they're not really trying to do the same thing. But because it's interesting, I just want to bypass all of the overdrives and just show you kind of what it sounds like when I crank my amp up and what it sounds like when I crank the Dream up. So obviously both sound pretty different, but they both sound really cool cranked up. As for modulation and time-based effects, it's pretty obvious. They both take them really well. When they're set up clean, they sound good going into them. The nice thing obviously about the Dream or something similar is that if I do want to run it dirtier, I can run like delay and a reverb afterwards and it still works fine, where I do not have an effects loop with this amp. But for me, it doesn't really matter because I'm running them both clean either way. So I'm just going to set these back to being quite clean like this. Set this one back here. So if I wanted to slap a big reverb on there, it would sound like this. Then I could do like an analog delay, so something like this. Again, both sound really cool, straightforward. Any other effects are kind of going to be the same thing because, like I said, they're both set up pretty clean. Okay, so that's going to be it for the tone comparison. Like I said, I'm going to keep it short because they really are trying to do very different things. But let's get into the actual pros and cons of each. So I think the first big win for an amp sim pedal is pretty obvious. It's size and weight. I cannot tell you how much my back has been thanking me when I've been taking the pedal instead of my amp to a gig. I've actually been able to pack my entire rig onto one pedal board, just bring one guitar. So I'm just showing up with a gig bag and then a case with my pedal board and a bunch of cables, and it just makes life really easy. So the second thing is consistency. And I think this is something that's super important and often overlooked, because when you show up to play somewhere and you've got an amp with you, you're going to be setting the volume of that amp and even the EQ of that amp differently depending on the size of the room, how many people are in the room, just the general sound of the room. And then on top of that, you're probably using the sound guys or the venue's mics to mic your amp. And what that means is that the sound that's coming through the PAs and that the audience is going to hear is going to differ night to night. When you're using an amp sim pedal, you're really not that worried about being too loud or too quiet. So you can just set it the exact same way you had it when you were at your home studio, or when you were at the rehearsal, or when you were at your last gig. I cannot stress enough how much that consistency actually matters, and not just for the audience. If I get up on stage and things don't sound exactly like what I'm used to and they don't sound quite right, it affects my playing. So knowing that I'm going to hear the exact same thing no matter where I am is a huge bonus. Okay, so the next big win for the amp sim kind of ties into the last one, and that just has to do with stage volume. Nowadays, depending on where you play, it's super important to keep your stage volume really low. And this is especially true for those of you that play at church or at smaller venues. The reality is that while a big amp sounds really, really good when it's turned up, a lot of times you don't even get the opportunity to turn it up loud enough to really get that tone out of it. And now that these amp sims are just starting to sound better and better, you're not really making such a big tonal sacrifice ditching your amp anymore. Another win for the amp sim pedal is flexibility. No matter which one you have, you've probably got a wider range of tones that you can get over an amp. For example, the Iridium can do Fender sounds all the way from blackface to tweed, as well as Marshall and Vox sounds. And even with something like the Dream 65 that's really only emulating one amp, with its mod switches and different IRs, I can get a crazy range of different Fendery sounds. And while my amp has a pretty good EQ section and spring reverb, it's really only giving me one tonal profile that I can turn up and down. And the last thing in this category is cost. Now, as far as pedals go, these amp sim pedals, like the Universal Audio stuff, the Strymon Iridium, or the Walrus ACS1, they are kind of on the expensive side, because spending $400 or $500 on a pedal is not cheap. But when you think about it, a good amp can cost you thousands of dollars. So even though they do seem pricey, they're really not that bad in comparison to the alternative. Okay, so now we're gonna get into why you would want to choose an amp instead. And the first reason is to combat the exact issue that I was talking about at the very beginning of the video, and that's that you have your own personal monitor on stage. So if you are playing in a place where you're able to get a little bit of volume out of your amp, it's really nice to not be at the mercy of your monitor system. And this is especially true when you're using in-ears. If I were to have my amp on stage with me at that gig, things would have gone so much better. This can be especially important if you have a really quick load-in and sound check, and maybe you don't have time to set your monitors exactly the way you want them. Then you can always pop an ear out or walk over and be able to hear yourself. So the next point is kind of obvious, and that is tone and feel. As good as these amp simulator pedals are getting, honestly, nothing feels as good as a real amp. In many cases, your audience really isn't going to notice a difference, but I'm pretty confident that you as a player, you would notice. There is a reason why high-end amp builders are still in business, and why people who really care about their tone still buy them and use them. For me, I'm always going to choose the tone and feel of my amp over the convenience of a pedal. And then the final thing is pretty subjective, but I believe that these tube amps are probably going to be a better long-term investment. Not that every amp out there is going to increase with price like vintage Fender and Marshall amps have, but they do seem to hold their value on the used market no matter how old they are, where I feel like these digital representations of amps are going to probably slowly get outdated and beaten by new technology, which might cause their price to drop over time. I can't say this for sure, this is just an assumption of mine, but I do feel more confident pouring more money into the real thing. Alright, so that's all I wanted to cover in this video. I hope it helps you make a choice between the two options. There really is no right answer, and the right choice for you is totally just going to depend on your circumstances. So I'd like to hear from you. Do you use an amp sim pedal? Do you use a real amplifier? Or do you use a combination of both? Please let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure you give it a thumbs up. And if you want to see more content, make sure you subscribe to the channel because I upload a new guitar video every single week. With all that said, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you guys in the next one.